Hey everybody, this is Bad at Keeping Secrets. I'm here today talking about The Light We Give, a newish book. It came out in July, right? Yeah, so
That's right. Yep.
it still feels really fresh, even though it's oddly October right now. I'm with Simran Jeet Singh, and we're talking about how Sikh wisdom, which I also learned in the book, can transform the way you think and your life, and hopefully help you if your goal is to live a more intentional, meaningful life. I think there's a lot in here that we can learn from your life experience. And so it's kind of part memoir, part going through Sikh wisdom, but also there's an element of self-help in there. But I was wondering if you could briefly talk a little bit about sort of your formal background for us, just to give people a grounding spot.
Yeah, sure. Well, you forgot to mention that it's part comedy, and
Oh,
I'm really, I'm really hoping this sets up my stand-up comedy career. So,
I mean, I do think it's a little like the comedy in it is really endearing, and I do think it adds a layer of like, don't take yourself so seriously constantly through the book, that I think is really refreshing as well. But can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, where you went to school?
yeah, sure. So I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. I have three brothers. We were some of the only Sikhs who were growing up down there, and the experience of being religiously different and visibly different really shaped my trajectory. And I, being marginalized and left out in so many different kinds of ways. I mean, I just hated that feeling, and I've really dedicated my life to addressing that. And so now I did my graduate school at Harvard and Columbia, focused on religion and race. I mean, that was very much informed by my lived experience of how I'm treated in this country. And after completing that work, I really wanted to focus on dealing with inequities on the basis of racial and religious difference. So that's a big part of what I do now with the Aspen Institute. It's what I did when I was teaching as a professor, and I still teach a bit. I used to teach Islamic studies in Texas. Now I teach Buddhist history here in New York. So I'm just a total nerd. But what I'll say is, through my studies, I've actually become more and more invested, not just in learning about religious difference and religious traditions, and not even just in ensuring equality across difference, but also, I mean, I've really personally been moved and transformed by the spiritual wisdom that I've been able to tap into. And so that's what this book is about. It's kind of bringing together those experiences of what it's like to be on the outside, looking in, what it's like to be in a position of real powerlessness in a way, and how we can each tap into spiritual wisdom to find the power within us and the light within us. And so that's part of my own journey, and that's what I'm trying to bring forward in this book.
You talk a bit, I think one of the things that I think is really strong about the sort of structure of the book is it really highlights the evolution of your faith for you. And how I think that we think about faith as this sort of static thing that just kind of is, or something that is, or at least for me. Can you talk a little bit about how, so like in high school, your connection to the Sikh traditions versus now, how moving through, I think one instance for me that comes up is, I think in high school you talk about your inclination was to fight or to solve issues of inequality or bullying through physical aggression, and how it was always sort of something your parents kind of had differing views on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's super interesting, right? Because there were moments early in my childhood in Texas where I had these experiences, and I actually opened the book with one of these stories, a really vivid one for me, where a soccer referee wouldn't let me play. He wanted to check my turban, and he said something. He said something to the effect of like, "We know you like to hide. Your people like to hide knives and bombs in there." And so I gave in that moment, and I hated myself for it. Like, I was a kid, I mean, what could I do, right? Here's a grown man telling me what to do. He's an authority figure, and I just want to play soccer. So like, of course I gave in, but I hated, for weeks that I didn't stand up for myself. And then in the years that followed, I found myself, maybe the right word is overreacting, or standing up for myself in a way that felt inappropriate still. Like I guess the upshot is I'd have these experiences where people would be racist or hateful or whatever, and I'd fight back, but I'd still walk away feeling like I didn't do the right thing. I wasn't proud of how I responded. Like I just knew there had to be a better way, but I didn't really know what it was. And so my parents' approach of like turn the other cheek was fine, but I didn't feel great about it. My approach of fighting back was also fine, but I didn't feel great about it. And so like, what is another way to engage in these moments where I can actually walk away feeling proud? Not that these moments will stop happening, but at least I can control what I can control. And I think that's where I really started to appreciate teachings in Sikh philosophy that give us, and I think many spiritual traditions offer us this. In Buddhism, it's called the middle way. Like, what is a way that you can walk a different path than what is either instinctive with fight or flight, or what is culturally conditioned in terms of how we see other people engage, and really come up with a way that makes us feel good about our responses, that helps us deal with the challenges in the moments without being so internally affected by them, so that we become hateful as we deal with hate, or we become angry as we deal with anger, right? Like that's such a natural thing to have happen, and it just didn't feel right to me. And so that's really what I think these teachings have to offer us today.
There was another instance in the book, I think in the Radical Connection, where you talk about how you were teaching, I think, a group of children about the Wisconsin
Mm,
Sikh temple shooting, about their responses and what that sort of brought up in you.
yeah, it's so funny. Like I don't know. Yeah, I can share that story, but I'm just sort of reflecting now how sometimes we know in our hearts what the right answer is, but it's so hard for us to find. Like I find this when I talk to my friends about their lives, right? Like it's so easy to give other people advice when you're on the outside looking in, and then you're messing up in your own life, and you're like, oh, I just need someone else to look in for a second and tell me what I'm doing wrong or where I'm missing the mark. And so I had this experience with kids in 2012 that I share in the book, which was a really tough moment for me and a lot of people in the Sikh community. A white supremacist in Wisconsin massacred the congregation while they prayed. At the time, it was the largest and most deadly massacre in a place of worship in the US since the civil rights movement. So this is like a big deal. And in a way, it was an even bigger deal for the Sikh community because it was the first time in our more than 100 years of being in this country that people actually paid attention to us, right? Like, so this is like one of the biggest and most important moments in Sikh history. And so I'm reacting to this as many people in our community are. I'm upset and I'm angry at this person. I mean, essentially because he's a grown man who is unable to contain his hate and his rage, and it ends up taking away innocent lives. Like, what is there not to be angry about? I was fuming. And over time, I started to realize that my anger was not dissipating. And then I go meet these kids in upstate New York at a Sikh camp, a camp that I had attended when I was a kid. And I asked these kids if they knew what happened, and they said yeah, and they all knew it. They all explained to me what had happened, and essentially I asked them like, why did this happen? And one of the kids says, well, he was evil. And in my head, I'm like, yeah, like that is my synonym for white supremacy and hatred. And then I pause for a second, and I'm like, oh my God, like we don't actually believe in evil in our tradition, right? This is not a concept that is innate to Sikhs. It's not something we ascribe to people. Like, we don't say people are evil. Our teaching is everyone is equally divine. We all have the same light in us. And as I was realizing what these kids were reflecting back to me, I was realizing that they were actually mirroring what I had been saying, like in the media for weeks, and also in front of them, right? Like, I had been essentially in my heart feeling like this guy was evil, and then bringing that out through any opportunity I had. And so I had to work through that. And part of the working through was actually in conversation with these kids in that moment, where we went back to the core teachings of Sikh philosophy, these ideas of we are all interconnected, we are all divine, we are all the same light. And what is it that causes us to do harmful things to one another when we don't recognize our light, our shared divinity, and so on. But it really took, I mean, it's kind of funny to say now, it was funny to realize then, but like, it did not happen in any other context, right? It took the innocence and the clarity of young kids to be able to see where I was going wrong. So it was just a really powerful, I mean, it was a really powerful moment for me as I was working through some of my anger in response to this attack, but it was also a really powerful experience to recognize that actually I knew in my heart what was true, but I needed these kids to help guide me through that process. And, you know, you never know where wisdom is going to come from. And I think we should all be always open to receiving it.
I think that's one of my favorite states of being, in that sort of aha movement of learning something new, or having your sort of thoughts kind of tumble away, and seeing things in a new way. I was wondering, I think something that I'm really interested in is how right now do you, or would you define the roles of good and evil, and sort of where they exist? I know that's kind of a broad question, and I'll try to make it more specific in that, and I don't want to answer this question for you, because I honestly don't know how you would, but I think for me, when I was growing up, these terms were readily applied to people and not actions. And I think there's this still prevalence, I guess, in my understanding of Western culture, to apply it to personhood. And I was wondering how in the sort of Sikh teachings, where is good and evil? What are those? How do we understand those terms in the context of being?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, I'll share honestly that, you know, this is confusing for a lot of people when I try and explain it. So I'll try and be more thorough. But although I grew up in a Sikh household, although I look very different from most people in this country, I grew up in South Texas, and most of the people around me were Christian. And my views were often informed by Christianity more than they were by Sikhism, right? So like,
oh, I buy that.
This is right. And so it's super interesting for me growing up, because as much as I would identify as a Sikh, sometimes my views would be drawing from what I learned about in movies, or what I learned about from my friends. And so I totally bought into the concept of good and evil growing up. And you know, people can hold multiple truths. And so in my head, I knew that Sikhs believe in oneness and the shared interconnectedness of our world. And I also believed in good and evil. And like, I thought that was fine. And then I get a little bit older, and I start trying to deal with these two competing narratives, right? Because in a way, what we're essentially saying is the world entirely interconnected through divinity? So is divinity permeating every aspect of our world, or are we able to say that there's a binary here, right? We can split between what is good and what is bad, what is pure and what is polluted, what is good, what is evil. And like, the more I thought about it, the more I was starting to realize that, at least for me, the binary way of looking at the world didn't make sense, right? And there are a lot of ways we could break it down logically or theologically, ideologically, right? Like, we could say, well, where do you draw the line? Is it on the basis of, you know, in the basis of where someone is born? on the basis of what race they are, right? This is how we get into ideas of racial supremacy. Is it on the basis of what someone believes? That's how we get into religious supremacy and religious fundamentalism. And so, like, none of that fit into my worldview in terms of what I wanted things to look like. And here's the other danger of it that I started to realize, especially recently, and that is when you are so quick to categorize on the basis of binaries. I mean, it becomes much easier to dehumanize people, right? Like, you say, those people over there are this way, we're this way. And, you see, if you look back over the last 10 years and see how we've become increasingly polarized, you can see how this binary way of thinking of good versus bad really creates a situation in which all of a sudden we're like, I am not talking to those people. They might be my family members, but screw them, right? Like, they voted for this person or that person or whatever. And like, that is not, to me, the way that I want to live in this world. And it doesn't fit into my conception of, our shared lives together in this world. And so, yeah, this is a long answer, but it's a way of saying, like, I don't buy it. Like, I know that's so much of how the world is viewed, how so many of us look at the world. And I think it's easier that way, because that's how we make sense of the pain that we feel sometimes, right? Like, life is hard. Let's find the people to blame and let's point our fingers at them.
I also think
And
certainty is very appealing.
certainty, yeah, exactly. I was just talking to Catherine May the other day about uncertainty and how important that is to our way of being in this world. And yeah, I think your point about certainty, yeah, that's such a good, it's so easy to believe that you are right and other people are wrong. Anyway, yeah, please. Yeah,
Oh, no,
I wonder how you'd react to that reflection.
I think that I wanted to take a little bit of a step back, and I was wondering if you could define in that context what you mean when you use the term divinity, in that as a secular person who is raised agnostic, these terms very much echo how I understand like current notions of positive psychology or ways of understanding brain chemistry and optimization to, like, again, live the life you want, or live more in alignment with your value system. And if you could unpack that term for me, I would be grateful for it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so the challenge for me is every word is loaded with meaning, and a lot of those meanings are drawing on people's perceptions and experiences. So, like, I'm very reticent to use the word God, because that for a lot of people invokes a particular understanding and even image of what I'm talking about, which is not the same as what I mean. And the same is true with the word divinity, because it's probably the best English equivalent I can find. In the Sikh tradition, at least as far as I understand it, divinity is understood as a force. At least this is how I think about it, and it's why I use the metaphor of light. It's a metaphor that's used commonly in our tradition, and in many traditions, spiritual and religious, in talking about this thing that is within us and all around us, but we can't actually perceive with our senses. So light is different, right? Because you can perceive it, but it's something that is at least relatable for us. Divinity, in my view, is is this life-giving force that is something that's infused within each of us, within every aspect of the phenomenal world, something that is indescribable, something we can't put into words, something that goes beyond explanation. And in many ways, it is the thing that we feel. It is not the thing that we see or sense or even encounter in some ways. And so for me, part of what I find appealing about this worldview, about the Sikh worldview, is that it tends to align with my understanding of science as well. Right, there's nothing here that feels like there's some sort of miracle that's working outside of us, right? This is just the way of the world, and we're part of it. And one sort of one way I think about divinity being infused in the world, which I understand is either foreign to people or is seen as being I don't know, backwards or pagan or uncivilized or whatever. Like, I think there's something really simple and beautiful about it, which, you know, at least in my mind, I try and imagine, I don't know, what am I holding? Like my glasses here, like my glasses, if we break down the component parts, we get to molecules and atoms. And if we just think about those molecules and atoms that make up my glasses and make up the world as being infused with this same light, like then of course everything around us is equally beautiful, equally special. Like there's nothing that is not divine, so how could there be anything that's good or bad? Everything just is. And I find that to be such a simple and beautiful way of living.
What are the sort of, so you teach different faiths, you've taught different faiths throughout your career, and kind of going back to how you said when you grew up, you sort of mirrored the behavior of the Christian community that you grew up in. Are there other different sort of global faiths that you feel like people could understand or use as sort of not a portal of understanding or seeing the sort of parallels between those faiths and the Sikh faith?
Yeah, there are a lot. I think every tradition. Yeah, so the easy answer is to say like every tradition has aspects of it that might be overlapping in some way. A more complicated answer is to say within every tradition there are strands of interpretation that more closely mirror similar strands in other traditions than they do in other versions of that same tradition, right? Like, so a mystical interpretation of Islam will be closer to a mystical interpretation of Christianity than it will be to something that's more fundamentalist in Islam, if that makes sense.
Never thought about it that way. Sorry. Yeah. Keep going.
No. No, well, I mean, part of what makes me come to recognize this is in studying various traditions, I found myself really attracted to mystical approaches. And wait, as I was,
I'm going to have you define mystical approaches, and then also continue with why you're attracted to them.
Well, I mean, maybe the easiest way of laying this out would be to say that in these traditions, the endpoint is love. Like you conceive of the ideal form of life as being in love, living with love, and essentially, and this is part of what I try and describe in the book, like we have these momentary experiences of love, and what mystical traditions tend to offer is you can have that feeling all the time. Like you can always be in love, and that's what my reading of Sikh philosophy is, right? Like that's why I find it so compelling and so countercultural, which is, you know, forget the metrics, forget the outputs and the outcomes, like forget heaven and hell, like who cares about all that? Like just find love in your life and live that way. So yeah, it is, that's an aspect of different religions that I find a way of thinking about different religious interpretations that I find really interesting.
I guess another thing I've been thinking about recently, and I'd love to hear your take on, is sort of the importance, and I know that these both are important, living with intention and how your actions actually have an effect on others. And I think that growing up in my household, intentions were what mattered most. And I married someone who is very action oriented. That intentions don't really matter if your actions aren't in alignment with the outcome that you want. And I was wondering if you could think about how you think about sort of the role of that in being an activist and figuring out kind of how to spend your time. And I don't know how you feel about using the word effective, but how to effectively transform society, or to do, I know we just defined good and evil, but to do the best that you can to echo you, to act with love, I guess.
Yeah, I love the question. I mean, especially in a lot of activist circles right now, there's a real question about intention and impact is the framing, and a lot of the activists right now will say it doesn't matter what your intention was, it just matters the harm you might have caused, right? The impact it had on me. Like, you might have intended, you might have all the best intentions, but your actions might be biased and harmful and racist and so on, right? So like, I get that. I've seen that play out, and I think that's something worth considering. But I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, and I think there's a danger there in saying, well, it's all about intention and it's all about impact, and I think that's kind of the zero sum we end up at so many times when we're having these conversations. And what Sikh philosophy offers us is actually the two go hand in hand. That it matters what you do in the world, but it also matters what's in your heart when you do it. And I think part of what helps us to understand why is if we step back and we understand what is the point of service, right? Service is twofold, right? In American activism and in Western activism, service is onefold, right? We talk about activism as alleviating suffering, as creating justice, and that's great. We don't think about the internal impact it has on us when we do it, right? There is actual spiritual transformation that happens through service. And we've heard all sorts of luminaries talk about this, including Dr. King and Jesus Christ, and like amazing people who are the best among us have done real, have offered real insight into what activism means. So to me, if you go in with the right intentions, it's not just about what you produce for others. You can actually decenter your ego. You can actually become less self-centered, become more humble, more connected to the people around you, more empathetic, more like all the things you want to be can happen through service. And so if we understand the twin function of service as transforming your heart while also transforming the world, then we will understand why intention and impact go hand in hand.
I think that's a really intuitive, I feel like the theme of this conversation is finding words and language around how we make sense of the world and what makes sense at this time. And I feel like having had like sort of using that understanding of decentering your ego in acts of service as a way to align intention and action, I think is really powerful. We only have a couple more minutes left, so I just wanted to say, what are you working on now that's getting you really excited and inspired, and sort of what keeps you going? Are there any projects you have coming up, or any ways? I mean, I know we didn't even talk about fatherhood, because I feel like that's a huge, and I don't know if you use that term, or parenthood or what have you, but having kids, how that must have threw a whole change into your understanding of faith and the role of faith.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely did. It's probably better we didn't talk about parenting, because I could talk for hours. and yeah,
it's endlessly fascinating. Yeah. I didn't realize how much that's like all I wanted to talk about once I had a kid.
Yeah, exactly. These girls are amazing, and yeah, they're at such good ages. They're young. They still like me. They still laugh at my jokes. Like it's all crazy. But yeah, I've learned so much. I mean, this is probably cliche, right? But like, I've learned so much about myself and about them and about people, and I've thought differently and lived differently. And so yeah, it's yeah, that's really great. In terms of what I'm working on, that's probably the biggest one. Is those kiddos. It's one of the, this sort of ties into our conversation. It's one of the reasons when my wife and I were talking about whether we wanted to have kids or not, one of the big reasons I gave her was because I just hear people talking about how different that love is and how much more it expands your ability to love. And I was like, I just want to experience that. And I will say that it's totally been true for me. Like, that's been a really, I mean, in a way, it's like a real spiritual experience, right? Like, you understand what it can be. I mean, it's also a very annoying experience. So like parenting cuts both ways. But there's so much that I've gained out of that. The projects that I'm working on, a lot of it is with them in mind. And one of the big ones, children's literature is something I've always loved and cared about, but it feels especially important with them around. And so I'm working on my next few picture books, which I'm really excited about and I'm having a lot of fun with. So that's probably the next big one.
I think that's also, super important in terms of transforming. Unfortunately, as a person who reads a lot of children's books, I can't wait to get my hands on it. But thinking about the motivation of having kids as a way to expand our understanding of love and relationships and connectedness was really at the heart of also why I chose to have a child. And not that there's I don't know if I necessarily believe there's a right or a wrong reason, and not to say that it's not hard, but it's definitely opened up an entirely new spectrum of existence. And to talk about decentering your ego.
Yeah, big time.
It's huge. Anyway, thank you so much for doing this with me. There were a couple points where I teared up just because what you're saying, I feel like is really an antidote to all the things that I'm feeling coming in through a lot of media outlets. And I just really appreciate you being a voice and being able to willing to put yourself out there for everybody. And for a better future. And so I really appreciate that. The Light We Give is out now. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, Clarissa. Great to meet you. Glad to be friends.
You too. Bye.